Good morning. Bibles to Ezekiel Chapter 23. Ezekiel Chapter 23. We continue to move through the book of Ezekiel and the prophet's statements regarding the nation of Judah and her relationship with God and some of the pagan nations around them. In chapter 23, he draws I guess you could say a comparison, kind of uses a story here, or whatever you want to refer to it, to draw a picture of the nation of Judah. He refers to two sisters, one of them named Aholah and one of them named Aholibah. He says you don't have to wonder about who he's referring to, because he tells you in the chapter. He tells you Aholah is a reference to Samaria, and Aholibah is a reference to Jerusalem. And now these are references to cities, not necessarily to tribes. He begins the chapter by talking about, he goes back to the origin. Where did the nation of Israel originate? Where did it form as a nation? Egypt. And so he talks about their origin, where they began, their origin in Egypt. And evidently, according to this story, they picked up some of Egypt's pagan practices, some of their idolatrous worship, which we know was a problem for the nation of Israel and Judah throughout most of their history. And he uses that as a starting point to begin to talk about these people. And he says Aholah is a reference to Sumeria, and Aholibah is a reference to Jerusalem. Aholah is referred to as the older sister because she was the first one to go into idolatry, not necessarily because she was the elder. If you look at it from a purely technical standpoint, Judah and Samaria were not sisters. But he uses this as an illustration to make a point. The word Aholah evidently translated means place of my tent, or her tent. And there are some who think that's a reference to throughout that part of the world at that time, there would have been shrines that were constructed. There would have been a platform that was built, and on top of that platform there would have been a tent constructed that was used as a tabernacle or a worship place for idol gods. And so these platforms with tents on them have been constructed throughout Samaria and the northern kingdom, simply because they were worshiping idol gods. And so a place of her tent very well could be a reference to the fact that those tents were scattered all throughout Samaria, to the northern part of Israel. Aholibah, which is the name of the other sister, means place of, or means my tent is in her. If you're talking about Jerusalem, whose tent was in Jerusalem? God's. The tabernacle, the temple was in Jerusalem. And so now you can't stretch this too far, but there are a lot of people who think that Aholah is a reference to the fact that there were those idol tents throughout the northern kingdom, and Aholibah is a reference to the temple or the tent of God actually being in the city of Jerusalem. But he begins by talking about the older sister. He said she played the whore while she was mine, and she lusted after her lovers, the Assyrians. When you go back and you read the history of the northern kingdom, you will find that during the reign of Omri and a couple of kings after that, there was an attempt made by the nation of Israel to form an alliance with Assyria. The relationship between Israel and Assyria actually began as a treaty between one another. Israel was being attacked by somebody else, and they persuaded Assyria to come to their aid. And so Israel is actually, in a figurative sense of the word, they're courting Assyria while they're supposed to be married to God. While they're supposed to be worshiping God and serving God, they are going after somebody else. And so the prophet here draws a picture. Oftentimes throughout Scripture, we know that the relationship between God and his people is referred to as a marriage. God married Israel. Christ married the church. And that there is a relationship there to which both parties are supposed to be faithful. Israel did not remain faithful. It went after other gods. It went after other nations. It became unfaithful. And so that's why it says she played the whore. She ran off after other countries and after other idol gods. When God entered this covenant relationship with Israel, his hope was that Israel would remain faithful. How many people do you know the day they get married walk down the aisle hoping that their spouse will be unfaithful to them? Not very many. You marry somebody with the hope that you can have a unique relationship there that you have with nobody else. That's God and Israel. He went into a covenant relationship with them with the hope that he could have a relationship with them like no other. And when you look at God's relationship with Israel, Israel had blessings. Israel had advantages that no other nation had. Now, we don't need to take this to the extreme and say that God wasn't concerned with other nations, because it certainly was. But you remember in Romans chapter 3, Paul was talking about the relationship, why Jews had the advantage over Gentiles. And he said, much in every way. Whereas unto them was committed the oracles of God. What other nation had a written law from God? What other nation had a temple in the middle of their nation that represented the dwelling place of God? What other nation was referred to as being God's special people? They had blessings. They had a relationship that nobody else had. And unfortunately, they took it for granted. Instead of remaining faithful to Jehovah, they went after other gods. They went after other nations. They went after other, trying to form alliances and treaties with them. And so he talks about the fact that you went a whoring after these. And then look at verse 9. Therefore I delivered her into the hands of her lovers and the hands of the Assyrians after whom she lusted. Israel tried to start a relationship with Assyria, and that relationship turned because Assyria became her destroyer. Israel was looking for a nation to have a covenant relationship with. Assyria was looking for another nation to overrun. They were going to use Israel for whatever they could get out of it. And that wasn't Israel's desire. And so Ezekiel said God turned her over. God turned Israel over to Assyria. What happened when God turned Israel over to Assyria? Never to be seen again. The northern kingdom was destroyed completely. The city of Samaria was burned to the ground. You hear sometimes people today talking about the 10 lost tribes of Israel. That's what they're talking about. The fact those 10 northern tribes went off into Assyrian captivity, and we never heard of them again. Now there were, I'm sure, some of those Jews from those 10 northern tribes who, when Babylon allowed Judah to come back to Jerusalem, no doubt some of those people came back with them. But as far as existing as a tribe, as a nation, that nation of Israel, that northern kingdom, went out of existence. Never again. And so this nation that Israel had lusted after, this nation that Israel had gone after, this nation that Israel had sought their idol gods, now became their destroyer. And so the northern kingdom is wiped out. Now, you go from the northern kingdom to the southern kingdom. Verse 11. Verse 10 talks about killed her with the sword. She became a byword among women. Verse 11, her sister Aholibah saw this and she became more corrupt. Now you would think that Jerusalem is watching this. Jerusalem is watching Samaria. Jerusalem is watching this idolatry and this immorality. Jerusalem is watching what happened to Assyria. You would think that would serve as a motivation to go the other direction. They said, well, this is what happened to Samaria. I don't want that. I'm going to stay faithful to God. And that's not what happened. What happened is that originally Jerusalem went after Assyria, just like the northern kingdom did. But then they weren't happy with just Assyria. Not only did they go after Assyria, they went after Chaldea or Babylon. Remember, Assyria was the world empire for a period of time, and then Assyria lost in a battle to Babylon, and Babylon becomes the world empire, and now Judah goes after Babylon. They're not satisfied with the lover that they had, that Israel had. They want another one. And in these passages, it talks about the fact that the Chaldeans were, I don't know, good-looking fellows. And that Jerusalem lusted after them. And so now Jerusalem begins to do the same thing that Samaria did. They're going after these idol gods. They're going after these foreign nations. They're turning their back on God. They're walking away from their relationship with God, from the law of God. And not only are they becoming idolatrous, they're becoming heathenistic. That is, they're living the moral lifestyle of a heathen. One of the things you find out is that once you remove from any society a foundational belief in the existence of a higher power, morality goes out the door. Because if there is no objective standard, then I become the standard.
Just open your eyes and look around us.
Right. Look what's happening in our world. When you reject God and when you reject the idea of an objective standard, there is no... Let me ask you this simple question. If there is no God, what did Adolf Hitler do that was wrong?
Really nothing, because there is no moral compass.
Not a single solitary thing. If there's no God, the only law he was amenable to was Germany's. And he was Germany's law. So it certainly didn't violate Germany's law. If there's no objective standard, if there's no standard outside of man, then everything that Hitler did was acceptable. If there is no objective standard, what's wrong with blowing up the World Trade Center? For those of you who didn't hear that, she said smart people know the Holocaust didn't happen anyway. Yeah. And so when Jerusalem turned its back on God and turned its back on God's law, they went off into immorality, they went off into idolatry, they went off into child sacrifice, they went off into all kinds of sexual uncleanness, all kinds of wickedness and immorality, and they became a nation just like the Babylonians, and just like the Assyrians, and just like the Egyptians when they were supposed to be God's people. They were supposed to be different. And that's a lesson you and I need to grab hold of today. Hear a lot of people today, we talked about this last week, we hear a lot of people today talking about the fact that the church is not relevant anymore because the church is so different than the world. We're supposed to be. We are supposed to be different than the world. God's people don't live by the same standard the world does. And when God's people begin living by the world's standards, they stop being God's people. And that's exactly what happened to Judah and Israel. The same thing that happened to Israel happened to Judah. God gave them up. You see, there are a couple of things I think I want to know. One of them is, it talks about God withdrawing his protection. God withdrew his protection from Judah, which made her vulnerable. Because the only thing that protected Judah was not Judah's army. The only thing that protected Judah was God. But not only did God withdraw his protection, God also went further and took the side of the Babylonians. And so not only did he cease being Judah's protector, he began being Judah's punisher. And as we've talked about on several occasions, when you are fighting against God, pardon my English, but you ain't going to win. You're not going to beat God. And so Judah ends up in the same position, just like her sister. You would have thought that she would have seen that what happened, and said, well, I want to go the other way. No, that's not what happened. She followed in the same footsteps, did the same thing, and the same thing happened because Babylon was not interested in having an equal relationship with Judah. Judah wanted a partner. Judah wanted somebody they could do business with, and they could have a relationship with, and all those kind of things like nations do when they have. Babylon didn't want a partner. Babylon wanted world dominance. Babylon wanted Judah to be subject to them. And there's even a passage here that talks about the fact that at a certain point, Judah was disgusted by Babylon. Judah began to hate Babylon. Guess when Judah began to hate Babylon? When they figured out what Babylon's real motives were. When they figured out there's going to be no equal partnership here. When they figured out this is not going to be what we want it to be. They're going to subjugate us, and they're going to rule over us, and we don't want anything to do with that. And so when they figured that out, when they came to the realization that Babylon was not going to help them, that Babylon was going to try to defeat them, did they then turn back to God? They turned to Egypt. Now, how in the world does that make sense? Egypt had been their enemy for hundreds of years. Why in the world, when you get in trouble, instead of turning to the God who created you and the God who loves you and the God who cares for you, why in the world would you turn to your worst enemy?
And the God that brought you out of Egypt.
That's right, the God who brought you out of Egypt to start with. They were in slavery in Egypt. There was an ongoing battle, kind of a skirmishes between Egypt and Judah for years. For a short period of time, there was peace between Judah and Israel. But that short period of peace was when Solomon married Pharaoh's daughter. So because of a marriage, there was some relationship there. But for hundreds of years, there was animosity and ill will and hatred between Judah and Egypt. And when trouble comes, when persecution comes, instead of turning to God, they turn to Egypt. Which just doesn't make any sense to me. And so what ended up happening to Judah is almost the same as what happened to Samaria. The city of Jerusalem was destroyed. The temple was laid flat. And all but the poorest of the people of the land were shipped out. In 586 BC, the city of Jerusalem had become a ruin. The only thing that's left was wild animals and very poor people. And the nation of Judah is no more. Now, there's one difference between the fate of Jerusalem and the fate of Samaria. What's that difference? What happened to Samaria after it was destroyed? What happened to Jerusalem after it was destroyed? Came back. The nation of Judah was allowed to return. The nation of Samaria was not. Now understand, it had nothing to do with the righteousness or the wickedness of Judah, of Jerusalem and Samaria. God brought Jerusalem back because he needed Jerusalem. He needed a nation through which to bring the Messiah. It had nothing to do with their own righteousness. When you get right down to it, if you read and study the Old Testament, you will find God selecting the nation of Israel had nothing to do with Israel. It had everything to do with Abraham. The Jews were selected not because they deserved it, and not because they were righteous and holy enough, but because God made a promise to Abraham. And they are the fulfillment of that promise. All of these things are based on God's righteousness and God's grace and God's mercy and God's promises, not Israel's. This is not about, in a way it is, but in a way it's not about Israel, it's about God. Many of them died in captivity. Many of them were taken captive. Their possessions were taken. Their homes were taken. They ended up in Babylonian captivity. She suffered the same fate as her sister. And you begin in about verse 28 and go to the end of the chapter, and you'll see that these things are kind of repeated. He talked about the fact what God had done. God punished Judah because of their wickedness, because of their immorality, and because of their unholiness. But you have to understand, we talked before about the fact that God's people and the world are supposed to be different. What does the world think of God's people when they begin living like the world? When there's no difference between us and the world, what does that say about us? What does that say about our ability and our opportunity to reach those people in the world? Those of you who have ever done any teaching trying to get people to obey the gospel, have you ever heard this statement? I'm never going to go to that church because there are too many hypocrites down there. I promise you, if you try to teach very many people, you've heard that. I don't know how many times I've heard it. And it's not a good excuse, because what you're saying is those hypocrites are closer to God than I am. That's really what you're saying when you say that. Using somebody else's actions as an excuse for what I'm doing or not doing is a cop-out. The fact of the matter is, those of us who are children of God should not be giving them that ammunition in the first place. And the name of God, the glory of God, the honor of God was being dragged through the mud because of Judah and Israel, because of Jerusalem and Samaria. And God really had no choice but to do what he did, because he cannot allow, if there are no consequences to wrong actions, what keeps you from committing the wrong action? I've heard this illustration before. I've used it myself. What keeps you, as a baker, what keeps you from putting your hand on a hot eye? I didn't think that was that hard a question. Pain. What happens? And there are people who are this way. What happens if you feel no pain? There are people who have a birth defect. They have a physical problem. They don't feel pain. The reason I don't put my hand on a hot eye is because I don't want to hurt. I don't like pain. That's a consequence to a wrong action. If there are no consequences, what keeps you from the wrong action? One of the reasons we've got so many and I could use another word, but I'm not going to. Children who are misbehaving nowadays is because there are no consequences. Nothing happens if they misbehave. Now, honey, don't you do that. Yeah. I can just imagine my mother saying, now, honey, don't you do that. There has to be consequences in order for discipline to work. Now, when you use the word discipline, discipline doesn't necessarily mean punishment. Discipline means training or teaching. So when you're talking about training or talking about discipline, you're talking about everything that you use in an attempt to get a person to go in the right way. And so the fact that the children of Judah and the children of Israel had walked off into immorality and idolatry and become unfaithful says that God has to do something. And so he punished them because of their wickedness. In verse 36, God talks about the fact to Ezekiel, he says, I want you to tell them, declare to them, go tell them what they have done and why this is happening to them as it's happening. There were some Jews who, when Babylon came, why is this happening to us? What have we done? We're God's people. We've got the temple. We've got the law. We've got the sacrifices. And Ezekiel is telling them, this is why this is happening. Look at what you have done. You're worshiping idol gods. You're living in immorality. You're mistreating the poor. You're mistreating the widows. You're mistreating the orphans. You're taking advantage of people. You're offering children as human sacrifices. There was no question that what they were doing was wrong, and there was no question they deserved what had happened, or they deserved what happened to them. I find that look in verse 40 is very interesting to me. They even sent for men to come afar, to whom a messenger was sent, and behold, they came. For them you bathed yourself, painted your eyes, and adorned yourself with ornaments. You sat on a stately couch with a table spread before it, which you had placed my incense and my oil. What do you get a picture of when you read that verse? You painted your eyes, you adorned yourself with ornaments, you put on perfume. What's that sound like? Sounds like a woman who's making herself beautiful for a man, doesn't it? She's getting ready. She's getting prepared because she wants him to come. She wants to catch him now. What she wants to catch him in may be a different issue, but she wants him. And so she beautifies herself. And the prophet here draws this picture of the nation of Judah trying to make themselves as attractive as possible for this foreign nation, these people that are coming in, these men that are coming in, these envoys that are coming in. They're going to have discussions with, they're going to talk about having treaties and arrangements with. We want to be as attractive. We want to put our best foot forward. We want to be as attractive as possible. And so we're going to put we're not going to show off all of our shortcomings and all of our problems and all our issues. We're going to hide those under the rug somewhere, because we want to present our best. And so we're going to beautify ourselves. Verse 43, I said of her who was worn out by adultery, now they will continue to use her for a whore, even her, for they have gone into her as men go into a prostitute. Judah had gone into this with one purpose. That wasn't what happened. They didn't get the agreement with Babylon they wanted. They got used. They got abused. They got taken advantage of. The problem with that was, or the issue with that was, they should have seen it coming. Because the very same thing happened to Samaria. The very same thing. You got 721, Samaria is destroyed. 586, Jerusalem is destroyed. 140 years later. Exact same issues. Starts out the exact same way, ends up in the exact same destruction. You would have thought they would have known better. Now, beginning in verse 46, they'll bring up a host against them, make them object of terror and plunder. The host shall stone them and cut them down with their swords. They shall kill their sons and their daughters, burn up their houses. Now, here's the point we need to make. Thus will I put an end to lewdness in the land, that all women may take warning and not commit lewdness as you have done. We've talked before about this. What did the Babylonian captivity do for Judah? It was actually a good thing.
No idol worship.
Got rid of idolatry. From the time they came out of Egypt until 586, they had a problem with idolatry. Sometimes off and on, sometimes out in open, sometimes hidden. There was a continual problem with idolatry for hundreds of years. The Babylonian captivity cured that problem. They never again worshiped idol gods in the sense of idols like the Egyptians, the Babylonians, and those wooden things that you actually fall down to worship. Idolatry, I don't think will ever be gone. Not in the strictest sense of the word. We still have idolatry in the United States of America. An idol is simply anything you put between you and God. That you give the glory and the honor to that God ought to get. That's an idol. That can be anything and anybody. But the thing about actually building idols out of wood and stone and then falling down and worshiping them as your God, that ceased with Babylon. Never happened again. And so it actually, in that sense, had a good result. It's unfortunate that Judah had to go through all of that to get that to happen. But it did happen. Now, one more point and I'm done. Look at the very last phrase of verse 49. We've talked about that several times over the last few weeks. There are dozens of times in the book of Ezekiel that exact phrase is found. You shall know I am the Lord God. One of the reasons God did what he did was to remind his people of who he was. They had been making a mockery of God and of his law and of his worship and of his relationship with them and of his temple. And he had had enough. And one of the things that comes through again and again and again throughout this book is you're going to know. You're going to see. You're going to understand who I am. And if you don't understand who God is through his mercy and his compassion and his goodness, you will find out through his wrath and his punishment. You cannot flaunt God. You cannot mock God and make fun of God and rebel against God and expect to get away with it. You shall know that I am God. And the eventual, I think you could say the eventual fulfillment of that statement will be Judgment Day. The strongest atheists who have ever lived. Every knee shall bow and every tongue shall confess that Jesus Christ is Lord for the glory of God the Father. And you can deny it all of your life. You can rail against it. You can fight against it. You can scream about it. You can fuss about it. Come that day, you're going to admit it. God is Jehovah. He is the ruler of the universe. And you cannot flout him and rebel against him and ignore him and expect to win. It just ain't going to happen. Anyone have a question or comment?
What is the difference with Samaria between the Old Testament and the New?
Basic same location, just different people. Samaria in the Old Testament was the capital of the northern kingdom. It was a Jewish city. By the time the New Testament rolled around, Samaria was a kind of an amalgamation between Jew and Gentile. There were some Jews who remained in that Samaria area when the northern kingdom was destroyed. There were Gentiles who brought in, and they intermarried. And so you had Jew and Gentile marrying, and yet they were referred to as the Samaritans because they were basically half-breeds, half Gentile, half Jew. You also have to remember, and I didn't know this for a long time. I found this out studying in a class when I was in college. At one time, there was actually a temple of God in Samaria. After, in the time between the Testaments, there was a actual descendant of Aaron, in the line of the priesthood, who married a person from Samaria. And because of that, he was kicked out of the temple. He was not allowed to serve as a priest anymore. His father-in-law built him a temple in Samaria. There was a temple of Jehovah with a descendant of Aaron as a priest in Samaria. That's why, remember John 4? The Samaritan woman said, "Our fathers say to worship at this mountain, you say Jerusalem." That's why. There was actually at one time a temple in Samaria that had been destroyed. And so there were amongst those Samaritans, there were some who were believers in Jehovah, many of them because they had descended from the original Jewish nation, even though they may by this point have been half-breeds. Still the same location though. Samaria, the city of Samaria never moved. It's still in the same place. It's a different political affiliation by that point. Anyone else? We will pick up with chapter 24 next Sunday morning.